Imagine going to bed tonight, then waking up and finding out your team left and moved 600 miles across the country. Well, that's exactly what the Baltimore Colts did in 1984. When Colts fans woke up on the morning of March 29th, they'd discover there was no more Baltimore Colts. They were now the Indianapolis Colts. In the dead of night, 15 moving trucks made their way from the Baltimore Colts Stadium to Indianapolis. Without so much as a single word, the Colts packed up everything while Baltimore was sleeping. So why did they leave in such a dramatic fashion? The truth is, the decision to move was not an overnight thing, despite this seemingly great escape. It was an accumulation of almost 20 years of problems. But there is one glaring issue that was there from the start. It began during the time of the first owner, Carroll Rosenblum. He owned the team from its inception, but by the late 60s he wasn't around much, spending most of his time in different cities. Suspicions began to rise that he was planning to move the Colts. I mean, he went as far as having a training camp practice in Tampa Bay, so the suspicions were grounded. There were many factors as to why. His wife preferred the West Coast, sellout games began to dwindle from 1970, which seemed to bother him, but most importantly was that glaring issue I already mentioned. That is, Memorial Stadium, the home of the Colts. The stadium had been built in 1921, but was mostly demolished and rebuilt in 1950. By the late 60s though, the stadium was in dire need of renovations, if not demolition. Despite negotiations with the city of Baltimore, a deal could never be reached. 1969 was the final straw for Rosenblum. The city revealed a major hike in rent, so Rosenblum could see he was not going to get a better stadium. Does that mean he was about to leave? Well, enter Dan Reeves, the owner of the Rams at the time, and he was dying of cancer, so he contacted Rosenblum offering to sell him the Rams. But for Rosenblum to sell the Colts and then buy the Rams would result in some pesky taxes he didn't want to pay. So they came up with a solution: find somebody to buy the Rams, then trade the two teams. Enter the hero of the day. Well, at least for now. He'll become the villain pretty quickly. Robert Irsay, who'd buy the Rams with a whole lot of debt. The issue with Memorial Stadium was still lingering, but Irsay was hopeful and was publicly adamant the Colts were not leaving. Whether he meant those words, well, who can say, but it would turn out not to be the case. But before we understand the problems that Irsay faced that led up to that night in 1984, we first need to understand the importance of the Colts to Baltimore. This isn't the local Walmart skipping town. This was a team deeply entrenched into the community, and it explains why the move still hurts fans to this day that were around to experience it. By the late 50s, thanks to the likes of Johnny Unitas and other Hall of Famers on the team, the Colts had become one of the premier franchises of the league, ultimately winning their first championship in 1958. And that's often referred to as the greatest game ever played. This gives the Colts an important role in NFL history, having a part to play in the popularization of the sport, which at the time was nowhere near the level of baseball. Athletes at the time didn't get paid much, so players would have regular jobs to supplement their income from football. This resulted in players connecting with members of the community, often working alongside fans. You weren't just rooting for these stars, you were rooting for your neighbor, as one fan put it. Because of this, the Colts developed an exceptionally loyal fan base, and they rewarded that loyalty with competitive play and a Super Bowl V victory as the cherry on top. With MVP performances from Johnny Unitas and other stars like Raymond Berry, Lenny Moore, and Artie Donovan, Colts players were the biggest stars in Baltimore. But as with all great teams, these stars began to age. And that brings us back to the Irsay era. Like I said, it didn't take him long to become public enemy number one. He churned through coaches, was abrasive, suffered drunken outbursts, and even charged into the locker room during a halftime game, demanding a quarterback change.
Where the hell does this all come from? Who started this?
The governor's
I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to talk to you.
This behavior annoyed a lot of fans. Then you had the team performance. The Colts' first season with him at the helm ended 5-9, their first season with a losing record in 16 years. In 1973, the Colts traded Johnny Unitas to the Chargers. Thankfully for the Colts, they picked up Burt Jones in the 1973 draft. Jones won MVP in 1976, and the Colts made it to the divisional round 3 straight years from 1975 to 1977. Yet it still wasn't that peak Colts from the decades gone by, and from 1977 till the year they left, the Colts didn't have a winning season. Attendance was inconsistent, often filling less than half the seats, and what would be the final home game had an attendance of just over 20,000. By the late 70s, the Colts were so bad that John Elway infamously refused to play for them if they drafted him in 1983. But a bad team with poor performance isn't enough to ditch a city. It was Memorial Stadium, and that was always in the back of Irsay's mind. So if it came down to a new stadium, and the Colts were so important to the city, why didn't Baltimore just build one? Firstly, there were attempts. The Baltidome was an ambitious 70,000-seated dome stadium, but it never got through the legislature due to high costs. And then a vote passed preventing the use of public funds for new stadiums. That seemed to seal the Colts' fate. Irsay began looking at other cities he could take the team to. But on the other hand, he would tell the media he had no plans on leaving. He'd say, "I'm staying," and then go to a city and think, "Yeah, I could move here." So politicians were in a difficult spot. Irsay had been flirting with other cities, so how could they appease this difficult owner who was not clearly committed to staying? In hindsight though, the only way the Colts would stay was with a new stadium. I don't think it was Irsay just wanting to move out of Baltimore. He was there for over a decade, but as with all these owners, it came down to money. Skyboxes were becoming a larger part of revenue from games, and Memorial Stadium had none. That meant a lot of lost money. And even though the city did provide money for renovations, skyboxes couldn't be fitted. And recall, Irsay used a lot of debt to buy this team. His pockets did not run that deep, so he needed state assistance. Despite all these problems, most didn't believe the Colts would actually leave. The issues with the stadium had been going on for almost 20 years at this point, and it was the Baltimore Colts after all. There could be no other name in front of the Colts, and that belief may have been the downfall. After a failed attempt to block Al Davis and the Raiders' move to LA, the stage was set. With the league not wanting another court battle, owners approved a move for Irsay to any city in March 1984. Indianapolis had built a new stadium, with no guarantee from the NFL they'd actually get a franchise, but it was the only way they even had a shot. But the risk almost did not pay off. With the court ruling favoring Al Davis's move from Oakland, the NFL temporarily suspended any plans for expansion. Did Indianapolis just waste millions of taxpayer money on a state-of-the-art new stadium to tempt a non-existent franchise? Well, if they weren't going to get an expansion team, maybe they could get an existing team to relocate, so they set their sights on the Colts. But they were not the number one choice. The Colts were set to move to Phoenix. Yeah, we could have had the Arizona Colts. However, after a meeting between Irsay and several people in Arizona, including the governor, got leaked, the meeting was cancelled. The deal was dead, and Irsay publicly denied there was any meeting to begin with, even though there was. Again, this kind of deception made it hard to deal with Irsay. As the only city competing for the Colts with a new stadium, Indianapolis emerged as frontrunners. Once Baltimore finally realized the Colts were going to move, they rushed to pass a bill allowing eminent domain over the team. This allows governments to take private property for public use and is typically used for projects like highways. And this is why the Colts left in such a dramatic fashion. With the threat of the team being seized, even if it wouldn't hold up in court, there was no point taking a chance. As his attorney later said, they had put a gun to our head and cocked it. We couldn't wait to find out if it was loaded. But they didn't want to draw attention. The deal with Arizona fell through due to leaks. Enter Operation Mayflower. The secrecy of moving an embassy in Washington, D.C., were Jim Irsay's words. The move was on a strictly need-to-know basis. The drivers of the moving trucks weren't even told the destination until the last minute. They could not afford another leak. At 11 p.m., Mayflower trucks of Mayflower Transit, an Indiana-based moving company, arrived at Memorial Stadium. Later into the night, the press would catch wind of this operation. It wasn't enough to stop the move at this point, though. Still, to keep a low profile and avoid state police seizing the contents of trucks, each vehicle took a different route to Indianapolis. Although the Colts left, their love for football would not die. One-off preseason games and short-lived USFL and CFL teams were popular, and the Colts marching band continued performing. The city would eventually be rewarded in 1996, when the Browns, ironically, relocated in a similar fashion. Not in trucks in the dead of night, but fairly callously by an incompetent owner. But that's a video in itself, which I've actually made here. In the end, it's still a wound that hasn't healed for many fans who lived through it. I think it's hard that the history of the team was taken with the Colts. If the franchise had been left in Baltimore, like it did in Cleveland, it might have eased the pain. In the end, however, both cities have Super Bowl winning franchises. It was ugly, but it seemed to work out.